Is the chaos at the front lines merely a smokescreen for a deeper campaign playing out behind closed doors? By the midpoint of October, the war in Ukraine had reached a fever pitch across every axis. Yet, the true struggle is now less about who advances a handful of meters, and more about the invisible forces shaping the fate of entire nations. While Russian forces have recently gained momentum, the headlines about shifting boundaries tell only a fraction of the story. In the battered city of Kharkov, devastation is measured not just in shattered buildings, but in the scale of psychological and infrastructural collapse. Entire districts are plunged into darkness after titanic explosions tear through the city's power grid. Infernos rage for hours, casting pillars of smoke above the skyline and leaving neighborhoods without heat, light, or even running water. Consider, for example, the Saltivka and Slobitsky districts. Residents there have spent nights huddled in basements, listening to the distant roar of generators, if they are fortunate enough to have any power at all. In one residential building, families have organized communal kitchens and stairwells, pooling dwindling food reserves and melting snow for water after pipes burst in the cold. This is not simply about bombs falling on military targets. It is a systematic assault on the very backbone of daily life. Kharkov has endured week after week of relentless pressure, an unceasing attack that erodes not only physical structures, but the spirit of its people. Each strike on a railway hub, power station, or logistics center chips away at both Ukraine's fighting capability and civilian resolve. Similar scenes unfolded during World War II's siege of Leningrad, when power and food shortages became weapons as deadly as artillery shells. Back then, the city's population was halved within 900 days, not just by direct violence, but by the slow grinding down of infrastructure and spirit. Today, Kharkov's citizens face a test of endurance eerily reminiscent of those dark days. The Ukrainian military, already stretched thin, now faces mounting setbacks. In Kupiansk, a recent counteroffensive ended in costly failure, with losses that may force commanders to rethink their entire approach. These defeats do not just weaken frontline units. They ripple through command centers, supply lines, and the fragile networks that sustain resistance. Picture a supply depot at the edge of Kupiansk, its shelves once stacked with ammunition and fuel. After the failed counteroffensive, not only are the shelves bare, but the roads leading to the depot are cratered and watched by drones, making every delivery a perilous mission. The war is entering a new, more insidious phase. Precision strikes are now aimed at the arteries that keep Ukraine alive: electricity, communications, and transport. Each blackout, each destroyed rail junction, silently undermines the ability to move troops, deliver aid, and maintain morale. The real battle is shifting away from the headlines, waged in the shadows of disrupted routines and crumbling infrastructure. If we fixate only on maps and territory, we risk missing the forces truly reshaping this conflict. The ultimate outcome may hinge not on which army seizes which village, but on whether a nation's infrastructure and its collective will can withstand night after night of calculated devastation. To understand how this invisible campaign is unfolding, we must look beyond the front lines. What happens when the lifelines of a nation are targeted, and how close is Ukraine to a breaking point? Behind every frontline dispatch, a quieter but equally lethal crisis unfolds. Ukraine's lifelines are being suffocated, strand by strand. The fight has shifted. It is no longer just about ground won or lost, but about a silent war for energy, mobility, and the bare essentials of survival. Russian forces are now focusing on precision strikes, targeting not only troops, but also the arteries that keep Ukraine alive. In Kharkov, entire neighborhoods have been cast into darkness, as massive explosions and fires erupt where critical infrastructure once stood. These scenes echo across the country, each blackout a stark reminder of how deeply these attacks are cutting. Take, for example, the railway network stretching from eastern Ukraine to the western border. After coordinated missile strikes, vital junctions in Dnipro and Poltava went offline, paralyzing both commercial freight and the movement of humanitarian aid. In response, authorities have had to deploy convoys of buses and trucks, often at great risk, to patch over the gaps. While headlines spotlight advances in places like Volchansk, Kupiansk, or the narrow stretch between Melivo and Khatnia, the more damaging story plays out off the map. Russian troops are capturing forest belts and key supply lines, isolating Ukrainian units, and starving them of everything from ammunition to food. Devastation deepens with orchestrated attacks on railway hubs. Major junctions have been struck, forcing Ukraine to scramble for alternative routes. Trains are delayed or cancelled, emergency buses pressed into service, yet chaos still reigns. The logistical web that feeds an army and a nation is being torn apart, thread by thread. On the ground, Russian tactics are evolving. In a recent operation, Russian forces used smoke to disorient and capture entire groups of Ukrainian soldiers, achieving victories without firing a shot. This willingness to innovate marks a dangerous shift in the tempo and unpredictability of the conflict. A practical example. In the dense forests near Siversk, Russian forces deployed drone-mounted speakers, broadcasting false orders and simulated gunfire, sowing confusion among defending troops. Units, uncertain about whether to retreat or hold, hesitated just long enough for Russian detachments to encircle them. Understanding these strategies is crucial. When the backbone of infrastructure collapses, no amount of training or weaponry can compensate. Civilians, caught in the crossfire, pay the highest price as services fail and daily life grinds to a halt. The true stakes of this conflict are hidden in these shifting tactics. It is not just the front lines that determine outcomes, but the slow, methodical erosion of what keeps a nation alive. When supply lines fracture, armies and cities can collapse, often before anyone grasps the threat. In Ukraine, the visible front hides a more insidious war. A calculated effort to break the nation's logistical lifeline, one substation and railway at a time. Russia has changed its approach. Instead of random missile barrages, there is now a coldly systematic offensive against Ukraine's infrastructure. Power substations, fuel depots, and rail junctions are no longer occasional targets. They are struck repeatedly, sometimes mere hours after frantic repairs, as if to prove no recovery is safe. The destruction of a single substation can cripple far more than a city's lights. When a crucial node fails, entire regions can plunge into darkness, fuel deliveries halt, and trains are left stranded for days. Each strike is not just a setback, it sets off a chain reaction, where the loss of one point threatens 1,000 others. To amplify this domino effect, Russian forces deploy everything from kamikaze drones and loitering munitions to high-precision cruise missiles. Each weapon is selected for its ability to paralyze, not merely to destroy. No warehouse, no rail line, no transformer is ever truly secure. Ukrainian officials and independent monitors are sounding urgent alarms. Railway traffic has slowed to a crawl along vital corridors. Schedules unravel as cargo is rerouted, and reliance on vulnerable diesel locomotives grows. These engines themselves need fuel, a resource now running dangerously thin. The timing is dire. With winter closing in, rain and mud mire military vehicles. Road convoys risk stalling or exposure. This makes every remaining supply route essential, even as they are battered by continual strikes. Desperation has bred innovation, but also exposes the scale of the disaster. Ukrainian troops now use modified farm drones and homemade robotic carts to shuttle supplies to cut off units. Such improvisations show both ingenuity and crisis. They are a last line of hope, not a sign of strength. If Ukraine's logistics unravel, catastrophe follows. Soldiers risk encirclement or isolation with no ammunition and no food. Whole towns may face evacuation. For civilians, losing power and transport in winter is not mere hardship. It is a humanitarian nightmare. In one chilling scenario, reminiscent of the Balkan Wars of the 1990s, entire towns could find themselves cut off and besieged, with international aid unable to cross the front lines. In Bosnia, for instance, the siege of Sarajevo lasted nearly 4 years, with the city relying on clandestine tunnels and UN airdrops to survive. Ukraine's cities now face a similar specter, as their logistical umbilical cords are systematically severed. As infrastructure unravels, individual heroism matters less. The war's balance is shifting, not in trenches, but in the quiet collapse of power grids and railway lines. As Ukraine's logistical backbone buckles, the question becomes not just how to fight, but how to endure. The next moves will decide who controls the tempo and the very survival of the nation. What happens when war is waged not just with bullets and trenches, but with targeted blows to power plants, railways, and the veins of a nation's infrastructure? In Ukraine, this question is no longer theoretical. The answer is emerging in real time, and the stakes are growing with each passing week. Military analysts warn that if the current barrage against infrastructure continues or intensifies, Ukrainian logistics could be pushed to the brink of collapse by the time winter arrives. The entire military and civilian supply chain depends on electricity and rail. Sever these arteries, and the impact is catastrophic. Fuel convoys stall. Ammunition piles up in the wrong places. Soldiers and relief workers find themselves stranded, unable to rotate or resupply. The chain reaction is swift and severe. A city cut off from the grid or rail line might become isolated overnight. The fear of sudden blackouts and shortages could spark panic, sending families fleeing from industrial centers and border towns alike. What once felt stable quickly unravels, and the rhythm of daily life is replaced by the anxiety of not knowing what will fail next. In this climate, Western support becomes a lifeline. Shipments of spare parts, generators, and humanitarian aid arrive as crucial reinforcements. Yet, political uncertainty in the United States casts a long shadow. With high-stakes talks looming between President Zelensky and former President Trump, the direction and timing of American aid hang in the balance. Any shift in policy could slow or shrink the flow of assistance, leaving Ukraine dangerously exposed at a moment when every day is critical. In the 1940s, during World War II, the Allied Operation Lifeline airlifts into Berlin kept the city alive during the Soviet blockade. Today, Ukraine's survival may depend on a similarly coordinated, relentless effort from its partners in the West. The struggle now extends beyond physical infrastructure into the battlefield of information. Both sides race to control the narrative, using every tragedy and triumph as ammunition for morale and influence. When a hospital or residential block is struck, the story itself becomes a weapon, fueling anger, confusion, and division. The goal: to shape global perception and weaken the enemy's resolve before a single shot is fired. Yet for ordinary Ukrainians, the psychological strain is relentless. Prolonged blackouts, empty fuel stations, and an endless stream of grim news sap strength and faith. Leaders face the daunting task of rallying a weary nation, even as skepticism and fatigue spread like cracks through the social fabric. The risk is no longer confined to the battlefield. If Ukraine's logistical backbone unravels, the consequences could cascade, eroding morale, fracturing government, and straining international alliances. The threat is not just of lost territory, but of systemic collapse, where the ability to endure and resist is measured in broken supply lines and broken spirits. As winter approaches, the contest over infrastructure is set to become even more decisive. The next phase will reveal whether Ukraine's resilience can withstand this relentless pressure, or if the nation's support systems will buckle under attack. Viewing the war through the prism of supply and resilience exposes uncomfortable realities and overlooked opportunities. Modern conflict's true battleground is not found in the shifting lines on a map, but in the relentless contests over fuel, power, and the uninterrupted flow of essentials. The steady rumble of trucks, the flicker of city lights, and the spirit of the civilian population are what truly determine whether an army can endure the siege. When these arteries are severed, even the mightiest city can be stalled before a single soldier moves. Targeted, systematic attacks on logistics, railways, bridges, energy grids often prove more decisive than any sweeping counteroffensive or bold territorial push. Destroyed rail lines leave the front starving, while crippled power stations plunge factories into silence and hospitals into darkness. Though these slow suffocations rarely dominate headlines, they can quietly dictate a nation's fate. Consider the American Civil War's Atlanta campaign. General Sherman's march to the sea did not just conquer territory. It cut the Confederacy's supply lines, burning railways and depots to ensure that the Southern armies could neither resupply nor reinforce. The campaign is remembered as a turning point, not for the battles, but for the collapse of logistics and morale that followed. Resilience on the defensive side buys precious days. Drones ferry vital goods when roads have crumbled. Emergency repairs keep the lights burning through another night. Alternate routes, hastily mapped, push forward dwindling supplies. But if the assault on infrastructure is relentless, no amount of improvisation can hold back collapse forever. For allies and aid providers, the message could not be clearer. Shipments of weapons alone are not enough. Bolstering the power grid, restoring rail links, and safeguarding the steady movement of food and medicine can matter more to survival than any single weapons delivery. Infrastructure resilience is not merely an economic concern. It is the line between survival and catastrophe. For distant observers, learning to spot these patterns is crucial. Seeing past the headlines and catching the early signs of logistical strain lets us anticipate disasters before they erupt. Are resupply convoys lagging? Are blackouts creeping from city to city? These are the warning flares that signal where time and hope are running thin. Yet news coverage habitually buries these shifts beneath tales of explosive attacks and dramatic clashes. Only by questioning sources, seeking diverse accounts, and tracking the underlying data can we assemble the true picture. If we fail to update our understanding, if we view the war solely as a contest of territory, not as a struggle over infrastructure and civilian endurance, we risk wasting aid, blundering strategies, and compounding needless suffering. This struggle over infrastructure and resilience is not unique to Ukraine. It is a lesson for every modern conflict. Recognizing these invisible battles may shape how future wars are fought and how nations survive. So what practical steps can nations under siege take? First, diversify supply routes wherever possible, using everything from river barges to underground pipelines. Second, train civilian populations in basic repair and survival skills, as Finland did during the Winter War when Soviet attacks targeted energy and food supplies. Third, create robust international coordination for emergency aid, ensuring that spare parts, fuel, and technical expertise can reach the most endangered areas quickly. Fourth, invest in decentralizing critical infrastructure. Microgrids, portable generators, and satellite communications can keep key services running even when centralized systems fail. In Estonia, for example, widespread cyber attacks in 2007 spurred the development of backup systems, an approach Ukraine is now racing to implement. And finally, never underestimate the power of psychological resilience. Public information campaigns, community solidarity, and transparent leadership can help populations endure what would otherwise be unthinkable hardship. What really decides the fate of tomorrow's war? Is it the shifting front lines on a map? Or is it the unseen threads that keep whole armies and cities alive? Today's headlines shout about towns gained and lost, but the true story of Ukraine's war is being written far from the obvious crossroads. Across Ukraine, a patient, methodical campaign is underway, one that quietly targets the arteries of national survival: power grids, rail lines, fuel depots. Each destroyed substation, each severed railway, chips away at the country's backbone. These are not the dramatic charges shown on television, but a relentless assault on the means to move, to fight, and even just to endure. Focusing only on which village changed hands today risks missing the deeper, more fateful blows. The slow collapse of infrastructure is a silent siege. Lights flicker out, trains grind to a halt, supplies dwindle, morale cracks. A city plunged into darkness, an army waiting for shells that never come. These are the hidden battles, just as decisive as any firefight. This is not simply about territory lost or gained. It is about the slow draining of a nation's ability to resist. Each strike on a railway junction, each blackout at a power hub, sends shockwaves through the entire war effort. Over time, these blows accumulate, turning the difference between a defensive line holding and a front collapsing into a matter of endurance. For reporters, policymakers, And anyone who truly wants to understand modern warfare, this is a hard lesson. If you follow only the headlines, you will always be behind the curve. The real pivots happen in silence, at midnight in a power station, at dawn in a remote supply yard. To glimpse the future of this war, and perhaps all wars to come, do not look just at the borders. Look at the systems that allow a nation to breathe and fight. Miss these invisible shifts, and you risk misunderstanding not just the strategy, but the suffering and the final outcome. In this shadow war, every cut leaves a scar. The question is, are you looking for the right wounds?